Good morning, good afternoon, good evening throughout the world. I am Scott Labar, coming to you from near Denver, Colorado, here in the United States. And I have the privilege and honor of moderating this great session about implementing the Marrakesh Treaty. And in a moment, I'm going to ask all of our panelists who are here at the moment to introduce themselves, to say what their role is with respect to the Marrakesh Treaty, and maybe tell us a little bit about why the Marrakesh Treaty is important to them. For me, I am General Legal Counsel to the National Federation of the Blind. And I've been representing the Federation here in the United States in one way or the other for nearly 3 decades now, at least a good 25 years anyway. And one of my assignments several years ago was to start working on what would become the Marrakesh Treaty. In fact, I started working on the treaty in 2009. I was asked by the president of the National Federation of the Blind at the time, Mark Maurer, to attend a hearing at our United States Copyright Office about the idea of a treaty, and I gave the thoughts of the National Federation of the Blind at that time, and that was the beginning of a very long effort. From that point forward, I represented the Federation at WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and there was a committee called the Standing Committee on Copyright and Related Rights, which took up the treaty in 2009. It was introduced at that time by Bolivia, Ecuador, and Paraguay, later joined by Mexico, and that's where we started with the treaty text. It got altered, it got amended, it got changed quite a bit over the next 4 years when, in 2013, and in fact, exactly 8 years ago, on June 28th, the Marrakesh Treaty was signed by the member states of WIPO, attending the diplomatic conference in, of course, Marrakesh. And it was, as I say, exactly 8 years ago today. The treaty was adopted on June 27th, but actually signed by the attending parties on the 28th of June. The 28th of June is also significant because on this day, 3 years ago, 2018, our United States Senate ratified the Marrakesh Treaty. So June 28th is a big day in the history of the Marrakesh Treaty, and so we are so happy to be here to celebrate with you. Now, why is the Marrakesh Treaty important to me? It's important to me because I am blind. I have been blind since age 10. And when I had my vision, I loved reading. And quite frankly, when I went blind and lost my vision, I thought I would never be able to read again. I'd never be able to pick up a book and enjoy it. Well, I learned that wasn't true, that I could get books in Braille. And I could get books on, at that time, believe it or not, on records, vinyl records from our Library of Congress National Library Service for the blind, and it's now called for the blind and print disabled. So I did that. I got my books either on records or later cassette tapes. I got them in Braille, but it was so frustrating because I had to wait. It seemed like forever to get my hands on the same book as my sighted colleagues were reading immediately. Why is that? Because anytime NLS or anybody else wanted to put a book into Braille or record an audio version on a specialized record, they had to get the permission of the copyright holder. And sometimes that took a really long time. Other times it was denied outright. We could never get a copy of the book. So in 1996, the United States adopted what we call the Chafee Amendment, which created copyright exceptions, which allows an authorized entity to copy a book into what we called at that time a specialized format. Now, it turns out 56 other countries would adopt similar laws, but there was no way to share in these copies across international borders. And that's why we started working on the Marrakesh Treaty, and that's why it's so important to me, because I had to change my plans in college. I was going to get a major also, a specialty in Spanish, but I couldn't. I couldn't get access to the books I needed anymore. Once would have had all the books I needed, but I couldn't get them in the United States. That's why the Marrakesh Treaty is so important to me. So let me introduce some people, the panelists that we have here now. And what we're going to do is the brief introduction. I'm going to have them introduce themselves, and then I'll call on specific people to give their presentations. After we all give our presentations, then we will open this up for questions and further commentary from the panel. So let's start first where we did all the work on the treaty. Let's go to Geneva, Switzerland. And Michelle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Scott. And I have to say, I was in the U.S. Copyright Office when you came to that first hearing. So our paths crossed back then and have continued to cross ever since. So my main role now with the Marrakesh Treaty is that I'm the director of the Copyright Law Division here at the World Intellectual Property Organization. And in that role, it's my job to work with our member states on joining and implementing the Marrakesh Treaty. And before that, I was the lead organizer of the 2013 Marrakesh Treaty Diplomatic Conference, both the logistical elements and the legal elements. So as you can imagine, that was a lot of work. There's some stories there. Maybe we can share some of them during this panel. And even before that, I was on the US government delegation to WIPO. And so the hearing that Scott mentioned was part of the process of learning about this proposal and advocating for the US position and ultimately advocating for the adoption of the treaty at WIPO before I changed hats and joined the organization in the secretariat role. So there are a lot of reasons why I really care about the Marrakesh Treaty. There are a lot of things that are unique about the Marrakesh Treaty as an international copyright instrument. I come from the copyright perspective, copyright lawyer by training, have been for many years. But one of the things that is very attractive to me and to many people in our organization, honestly, is that this is not only a copyright treaty, it's also a human rights treaty. We work very closely, for example, with the committee which monitors implementation of the Convention of the right on the rights of persons with disabilities, and they make sure that they monitor Marrakesh Treaty implementation. That element is attractive. It's a development-friendly treaty. It works toward or helps contribute toward achieving a number of the SDGs that we're all working toward, the strategic development goals that are set by the United Nations. It's also an interesting treaty from the copyright perspective because it's an exceptions and limitations treaty. It's not a treaty focused on the copyright rights that creators and authors have so much as on exceptions to those rights in a particular instance where the case was made that the marketplace was not meeting the needs, that there also was a real need for international coordination. And that element is also unique because copyright is generally looked at from the national territorial perspective, and yet one of the biggest features of the Marrakesh Treaty is that it allows cross-border transfer of works. And that was one of the biggest reasons given for adopting the treaty and for the need for the treaty. So all of those are things that are really interesting, both from a professional legal perspective, but also from a humanitarian perspective. And just as a person who loves reading, you know, I can't imagine not reading, and I would like to help everybody be able to read. And so this is an interesting and kind of unique way to be able to work on that. I'll stop there for now, but look forward to sharing more with all of you later on.
Thank you so much, Michelle. We will now go from Geneva to Madrid and to the sponsoring organization of this wonderful summit, Once and Carmen. I'm going to screw up her name, but I'm going to give it my best try here. Carmen Bayarri Torrecillas.
Tengo un nombre muy difícil, sí. Muchísimas gracias, buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches para todos. Muchísimas gracias, es un placer y un honor para mí tener el privilegio de poder dirigirme a tantas y tantas personas que nos están escuchando, que además están interesadas en este Marrakesh Treaty, en el Tratado de Marrakech, y así contribuir con mi granito de arena a que mañana las personas ciegas del mundo tengamos un mundo mejor. Llevo dirigiendo el servicio bibliográfico de la ONCE desde 2015, así que al frente de un magnífico equipo de profesionales me ha tocado iniciar la andadura de este excepcional proyecto precioso e ilusionante, aquí en España con la ONCE. Durante 5 años también estuve al frente de uno de los centros de recursos educativos que tiene la ONCE y por tanto también tengo esa perspectiva de la educación que no se puede perder porque es fundamental. Y como Scott, yo soy ciega también y por tanto tengo mi propio interés personal en poder acceder a esos libros. Me gustaría aprender inglés, por cierto, así que gracias al Tratado de Marrakech espero poder acceder a esos libros que puedo conseguir en otros idiomas ya. ¿Por qué es para mí importante el Tratado de Marrakech? Pues para mí es muy importante. Y es muy importante porque creo que es la piedra angular que va a hacer que evolucione, que crezca la información y la formación que van a poder recibir personas ciegas de todo el mundo, sobre todo en países menos desarrollados, y eso va a hacer que estas personas tengan más oportunidades y, por tanto, mejor calidad de vida. Además, también estoy firmemente convencida de que el Tratado de Marrakech, a lo largo de esta evolución, nos va a brindar más vías de comunicación entre las entidades, entre las asociaciones de personas ciegas. Creo que nos va a hacer estrechar más esos lazos y creo que eso nos va a ayudar a crecer y hacernos más fuertes como un gran grupo de personas que, aunque nos diferencien ciertas cosas, como por ejemplo el idioma, tenemos un propósito en común que es mejorar la vida de las personas ciegas.
Gracias, Carmen. That was wonderful. And we will now go way across the world, down to, at least from our perspective here in North America, down to New Zealand. Martine, please introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. I must be the only person that's really in on the 29th of June, but I'll pretend it's the 28th because of such a significant date. Anyway, it was probably on the 29th of June in New Zealand when this happened anyway, with the Marrakesh Treaty signage. I'm Martine Abel-Williamson. I'm on the Accessible Books Consortium, and I'm as of a few days ago, the President-elect of the World Blind Union, which you've already heard was deeply steeped into the history and the making of the Marrakesh Treaty. I'm totally blind was born blind. At the age of 6 months, my parents, I was diagnosed as blind, and at the age of 1 year, I was born in Namibia, which is in Southwest Africa. And at that stage, my parents were told that I will not have the same access to information, books, opportunities, everything. And if they want me to go to a school, I need to go to a special school in South Africa. And they decided to move there. They didn't want to send me to another country. So my history as a child started by having to emigrate because of lack of access or the prediction of lack of access. And now I'm here in New Zealand. I'm on the board of Blind Citizens New Zealand, and it's Blind Citizens New Zealand that is that holds a position on the Accessible Books Consortium, where we and WIPO and so many others, libraries and agencies across the world are trying to carry on the implementation of the Marrakesh Treaty, because now that it's ratified, that is not the end of our work, unfortunately. I'm closely linked to the Pacific, and there are so many nations where people are probably in theory able to access a lot of reading material, but this hasn't realized this yet. And when I talk later on, I can talk a little bit more about that. So that is my short introduction. Thank you for having me with you on this panel.
Well, thank you, Martine, and congratulations, I'm sure, from all of us out here in the webinar. Congratulations to you on being president-elect of WBU, and I know your presidency will include a priority or maintaining the priority of the right to access information, and part of that, of course, is pursuing full implementation across the whole world of the Marrakesh Treaty. Now, I think next I'm going to turn back to Michelle, and I'm going to ask her to tell us where we are with implementation, ratifications, accessions, etc., and to talk about anything else she would like to talk about, hopefully a little bit about some advice, perhaps, about how we can get back to work with regard to implementation. You know, this awful pandemic has really caused a cessation of a lot of the work on the Marrakesh Treaty. It's understandable, but hopefully we are at the stage where that will change and we can get back to work, because prior to this awful COVID-19 global pandemic, we were really on a roll, or at least that's kind of what I felt like. So, Michelle, back over to you.
Thanks, Scott. And I would agree with you. Prior to the pandemic, we were seeing here at WIPO a country ratifying or exceeding the Marrakesh Treaty. It seemed, if not every week, at least every month. And that has slowed down, but I'll talk a little more about that. So just to back up a little bit, I'm guessing we probably have a pretty informed audience, but in very broad lines, what does the Marrakesh Treaty do? Well, it has two main principles. One, that books or publications can be produced in accessible formats such as Braille, audio, or e-text without needing permission from the copyright owner or copyright holder, the rights holders, and that these accessible books can then be freely exchanged across borders for the benefit of persons who are blind, visually impaired, and or print disabled, once again, without needing permission from the copyright owners, copyright holders. So those are the two main principles. We, as Scott mentioned, started out at the diplomatic conference with this new treaty, new text. It was a very exciting time. There was a little, I think we went there thinking, all right, we're pretty close. Text is pretty well developed. This should not be too hard. There was a moment where suddenly we thought, maybe we were too complacent. Maybe we didn't allow enough time for the diplomatic conference, where the president of the meeting, the chair of the meeting, was announcing that he was going to close the airport and not let anyone leave until this treaty was completed. So we went from that kind of stress to the point where we were able to bring in Stevie Wonder to join us for a really joyous celebration of the adoption of the treaty text. But then that's when the real work begins. Martina alluded to this, because there are a number of steps to actually make a treaty effective and to implement its provisions, starting with potentially signing the treaty, but then, which is optional, but is a commitment to uphold the treaty principles, to the question of ratifying or acceding to the treaty. You ratify if you signed before, you accede if you didn't, but otherwise it really doesn't matter which of these things countries do. But this is a binding commitment made in whatever process that country uses to join treaties, and has to be signed by the equivalent of the president, the prime minister, or the foreign secretary or secretary of state, as would be in the United States. So it has to be signed at that level and deposited with the Director General at WIPO. That may not sound terribly complicated, but that is something that is a process that takes quite a bit of time in many countries, and you have to reach a certain milestone of threshold of number of countries that have joined the treaty by ratifying or acceding before it comes into force, before it's effective and it's binding on the countries that have joined it to that point. After that, each country, as they join, will have it become binding within 3 months. But in this case, there was a period of 5 years before we got the 20 treaty members to bring the treaty into force. And I've heard a lot of people say, wow, that took so long. No, actually, that is fast for an international treaty, very fast, which gives you some sense of the complexity of the process we're dealing with. And this treaty, as Scott said, has had momentum. It's really been a milestone in the history of WIPO. It's our fastest growing treaty in the modern era. And it currently has 79 contracting parties covering 105 countries. That's because the European Union joined in one block. So well more than 50% of the countries that have joined our foundational copyright treaty, the Berne Convention, have already joined the Marrakesh Treaty. But we want to get to the point where all the countries that have joined the Berne Convention, or even more countries potentially, there are a few more, will be a member of this treaty. And that looks achievable. There's a lot of commitment, there's a lot of interest, but there are challenges. As Scott mentioned, there's the pandemic, of course, that has slowed things down. There was a lot of momentum, and it continued through 2020. We were still seeing kind of the results of work that had been done. But we have learned throughout this pandemic that there are some things that are harder to replace by video conference, by Zoom calls, by telephone. There are some regions of the world where, frankly, that access and the ability to communicate on those networks, there are technical reasons why that really isn't feasible. And we've done our best to work around that, but we have realized that this is one of those things, it's a bit, boots on the ground. We've got to get people out there working with member states, with the stakeholders, with the representatives of what we call the beneficiaries, persons who are blind and visually impaired, with the government representatives, often with the legislatures who need explanation, may need help with text, may need help with rolling out the sort of explanation of the treaty, even if everybody's on board with the basic concept. And a lot of that can be done at a distance, but not all of it. you can't replace entirely personal contact as an effective way of working with member states to move the treaty process along. So when we talk about this process, one of the things that tends to be most time consuming and potentially difficult is implementation in national laws. So in a few cases, when a country joins a treaty, it becomes directly effective without the need to change the national law. But in many cases, a treaty is not fully effective until it is implemented in national law. And in this case, even those countries, Scott alluded to about a third of them in the world, that had some kind of exception that met the first element of the two main objectives of the treaty, the production of works in accessible formats, mostly did not have cross-border transfer provisions and certainly did not have them explicitly. There might have been a few cases where it could have been done, but the provisions were not explicit. So many countries needed to add something, even if a relatively minor provision, to their domestic laws in order to implement the Marrakesh Treaty. And the legislative process, as I'm sure all of you are very well aware, can take a lot of time at the best of times and is very prone to getting caught up into other national discussions, into other negotiations, so that often you're not talking about a standalone process that's just treating one issue. That can complicate things, as you can imagine. That at the same time, I said 5 years wasn't too long. Often in many countries, the implementation and adoption of legislation has been gone pretty fast. Scott, you may want to comment, I don't know, but I mean, the fact of getting, the treaty through in the US during the Trump administration was certainly, you all should be credited with a great lobbying effort for that. But beyond that, that showed the universality of the appeal of the topic, but nevertheless, it still takes a lot of time. And that's important because, and I'll mention, it's been mentioned before, but our global book service for the Accessible Books Consortium, in order for a country to benefit from that service and to receive books through that service without permission, they do need to tell us that they have actually implemented the Marrakesh Treaty. And sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge to get that assurance that we need for the ABC. Even if we think the country might have implemented, getting someone to actually commit to it in writing, send it to WIPO, sometimes that can take some time. One of the
Michelle, are you there?
Area, of course, that is a good thing, but at the same time, it means that member states can implement in a variety of different ways, some of which may not be viewed by some legal experts as entirely compatible with each other. I think we've done pretty well at working through that over the years, but it is something that we do have to keep in mind when working on implementation. And then there's a resource question. We focus a lot on helping with implementation for the purpose of facilitating education, particularly facilitating education in local languages, providing materials for education in local languages. But often there's a gap of resources. We've been able at WIPO to work with some of our member states that have funds in trust. Australia's been generous. Republic of Korea has been generous. Japan's been generous. So that has helped a lot. And of course, we commit some of our own resources. But at the same time, it feels always like there's more that's needed. And we know we can't fund everything. That's just not feasible for our role in kind of the world and our the role of our organization. So we need to try and help leverage the resources we have to use them as most effectively as possible, but also to find a lot of other partners to help with this work. So just very quickly, I'll mention a little bit more about the Accessible Books Consortium. The Global Book Service in particular is the second largest collection of accessible titles in the world, with a global catalog of more than 630,000 books in accessible formats, including ONCE's collection of approximately 45,000 high-quality titles in Spanish. These titles are all freely available for cross-border exchange for Marrakesh Treaty beneficiaries, for those countries that have implemented the Marrakesh Treaty and been able to work with us to locate what's called an authorized entity, an entity in the country that can take charge of the process of, and these are often libraries, but not always libraries, the process of actually working with the beneficiaries and providing the books. But it's a complex system and very resource intensive. And so there are challenges that come with that. I know we have two of our distinguished board members, maybe more even participating, but two on the panel, Martine and Scott. So they may well give some more information about ABC from their perspective later in the panel. I'll stop there, Scott, and turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that very informative presentation. I do have a lot of comments, but I guess what I'm going to do is hold off on those because I want to make sure everybody gets their sort of primary presentation in fully. But I'm going to detour a little bit from that path, and we now have been joined by our final panelist, I do believe. Martin, you're here?
Right, Scott, I'm here.
Okay, well, Martin, what I asked the other panelists to do when we kicked off was to introduce themselves, explain their role, and then maybe say just a word or two about why the Marrakesh Treaty is important to you. So if you don't mind, if I could get that from you, we'll take that now, and then we'll return after you to Carmen for her main presentation. So Martin, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
Thank you very much, Scott. Hello, panelists, and hello, participants. I'm sorry, I was in another panel. I was speaking with no vision and had to skip that after my presentation. My name is Martin Kieti. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I am involved, I think, directly with the Marrakesh Treaty work. I represent Benetech, which is the organization that manages the largest library or collection of material for people with print disabilities. The previous speaker talked about the ABC, the collection being the second largest. So I could boast a little of being part of the largest collection. And I also work with the DAISY Consortium. For both those organizations, I promote the Marrakesh Treaty in Africa and accessible reading and publishing. I also work with the ICEVI, the International Council for the Education of People with Visual Impairment in Africa, as Secretary General, where we also run programs on making content accessible. I am also serving in the boards of a number of organizations that are also doing this kind of work, including here in Kenya, serving as the chair of the Kenya Institute for the Blind, which is the government agency that produces books and other learning materials for people with visual impairment. Is that good enough for starters?
Yes, Martin, and how about just one word for you personally, what does the Marrakesh Treaty mean? Why is it important to you?
Books. Books and books. The Marrakesh Treaty allows countries that are contracting to open up access to books And we have seen this happening. I believe that is going to be part of my short presentation thereafter. But yes, we have seen people read. That's the work I do day in, day out, bringing books to countries around the continent. And there's a big difference in countries that have ratified the Marrakesh Treaty. We are seeing people now starting to read. We just gotten a big number of people today who are registering to read books from Uganda. And that's one of the 9, 10, 11, 12 countries where now we have strong reading communities, purely out of this Marrakesh ratification and promotion campaigns. So to me, it's books, books for education, books for leisure, books for independent reading, and books for, for development. Thank you.
Thank you, Amar. Now, it's all about books. Absolutely. And of course, books contain information, and information, the access to information and the ability to use it leads to power and the ability to change your status in the world, regardless of where you are. If you don't have access to information, you don't have access to the ability to change the world and to make it a better place. All right, so Carmen, we'll go back over to you now, if you don't mind, and can you please talk to us about Este and what it has been doing to implement the Marrakesh Treaty and anything else you would like to share during your main presentation?
Bueno, pues recordar un poco que en 2017 el Parlamento Europeo aprueba la directiva y el reglamento que va a hacer que todos los países miembros tengan que cambiar su propiedad, sus leyes de propiedad intelectual. El 1 de octubre de 2018 se ratifica el Tratado de Marrakech por la Unión Europea y el 1 de enero de 2019 está en ejecución para todos los Estados miembros. La ONCE es una entidad autorizada, es una entidad que además tiene la capacidad de poder llevar a cabo las vertientes que contempla el Tratado de Marrakech, que son la adaptación y producción de libros, la importación y la exportación de los mismos. Hay tres cuestiones previas fundamentales que hicieron posible que este gran hito para las personas con discapacidad visual del planeta, que la ONCE apoya desde la vertiente más solidaria y sigue apoyando y apoyará siempre. Existen tres cuestiones que son fundamentales para que en el caso de la ONCE haya sido positiva esta puesta en marcha. La primera es el respaldo y la comunicación fluida que hemos tenido con la administración pública de nuestro país, con el gobierno de nuestro país. También el asesoramiento jurídico que hemos tenido para que todo lo que rodeara al proyecto estuviese estrictamente sujeto a la legislación vigente. Y, por supuesto, la tercera es poder disponer de los recursos económicos, materiales y humanos que hicieran posible esta puesta en marcha del proyecto de Tratado de Marrakech. Para nosotros, bueno, pues para dividirlo de alguna manera gráficamente, teníamos que buscar la posibilidad de exportar libros y también de importarlos. Entonces, para importarlos, firmamos un acuerdo con el Accessible Book Consortium, espero haberlo dicho bien, ABC, que además es una plataforma auspiciada por OMPI, por lo que, aparte de darnos acceso a un espectacular catálogo con numerosos libros accesibles, además nos da una garantía jurídica que nos va a permitir también establecer comunicaciones al margen de ABC con países con los que ya hayamos compartido libros a través de esta plataforma. Para para la exportación de libros, para poder enviar libros. También lo podemos hacer a través de la plataforma de ABC, el Global Book Service. Y también creamos una propia plataforma para aquellas personas que no para aquellas entidades que no están en ABC, una web propia que se alimenta de la biblioteca digital que ya tenemos en 11 y que va a permitir que todas las obras que hemos hecho, que hemos adaptado en la 11 se exporten, pero no aquellas que hemos importado. Las que hemos importado no se pueden acceder desde esta web. Si las entidades que quieren acceder a nuestra web, a nuestra propia web de Marrakech, si ya hemos compartido con ellos libros a través de ABC, pues va a ser muy sencillo, porque lo único que vamos a requerir es un documento que nos permita manejar los datos personales que necesitamos. Y el resto de entidades, bueno, pues van a tener que entregarnos una documentación, y si todo es correcto, les vamos a dar un usuario y una contraseña que les va a permitir descargarse pues las obras que ellos necesiten compartir. ¿Cuál es la ventaja de estar en, bueno, porque la ventaja de estar en ABC obviamente es la cantidad de títulos que tienen, que tenemos a nuestra disposición, que es tremendo. La ventaja de entrar en nuestra propia web es, primero, que ya se pueden acceder también a libros en braille y partituras, que actualmente en ABC todavía estamos pendientes de implementar, y que las actualizaciones que realizamos en nuestra biblioteca son semanales. Actualmente en esa biblioteca se pueden disponer de más de 37.000 obras en DAISY, más de 29.500 obras en braille y más de 3.400 partituras. Estamos hablando de un total de 70.000 libros accesibles. 31.000 de ellos son de literatura, el resto es de otras materias, pero también contamos con las últimas ediciones de libros de texto para los chicos que están estudiando. También ponemos a disposición una herramienta que le llamamos visualizador braille. Es una herramienta que nos va a permitir poder leer estos libros en braille a través de una línea braille, o incluso imprimirlos con una impresora, lo cual puede ser muy útil, pues, por ejemplo, para las partituras musicales. Los audios están en formato DAISY. En la página web de la ONCE, www.once.es, ahí hay una pestaña que se llama Internacional, que te va a llevar a un enlace de Marrakech, donde se va a poder obtener toda la información previa, no solamente de la documentación que se necesita, sino también de los datos de contacto, pues, para poder comunicarse con nuestra oficina de Marrakech de forma más ágil. Decir que la biblioteca digital de la ONCE es uno de los mejores patrimonios que tiene la ONCE. Es una biblioteca hecha gracias al esfuerzo de muchos vendedores que durante muchos años han estado vendiendo nuestros juegos en la calle, y también al trabajo de otros muchos profesionales. Es una biblioteca que se ha hecho con mucho respeto y con mucho cariño para todas las personas afiliadas de la ONCE, y ahora, gracias al Tratado de Marrakech, nos encanta poder entregarla también a cualquier persona ciega del mundo. Decir que entre ambas opciones, ABC y nuestra propia web de Marrakech, nuestros afiliados han podido disponer ya de 218 obras. Normalmente son en otros idiomas diferentes al español, y se han realizado ya 1.440 descargas. Nos parece unos números importantes, teniendo en cuenta que llevamos poco más de año y medio pudiendo hacer efectivo este intercambio. Hemos entregado 572 obras también a 14 entidades autorizadas de otros países.
Carmen, are you done for now, or is?
Yes, I finished.
Yes? Okay. Well, thank you for that wonderful presentation. It reminds me of two things. Well, first of all, I want to comment on something Michelle did say before, and I think it's true. The speed at which we got the Marrakesh Treaty adopted and now truly being implemented really is remarkable. And it really does kind of remind you of the song The Marrakesh Express by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. But it really has been an express ride. And the reason I think that is because of the commitment and passion of the advocates supporting the treaty and these efforts, and that's, of course, WBU and all of its affiliated organizations. But it's also been because of the partnerships that we've been able to develop with the rights holders, with governments, with all the people relevant to the discussion. And it was hard at first because we really did have to build up a level of trust, because copyright holders, rights holders, don't want to easily give away their exclusive rights. And one of their concerns was, of course, that, you know, if we allow this treaty to go forward, it'll make it easier for people to illegally copy works, and there could be a lot of pirating, you know, pirating as they call it, of works, and that was a large concern. And we had to be able to demonstrate that, no, the systems that we have in place are secure, that we're able to transfer these books safely and make sure that they're only getting into the hands of the people who should have them. And as the treaty calls it, beneficiary persons. We in the U.S. law call it eligible persons. There really hasn't been, even with the beginning of opening up all these works through ABC and through Bookshare. There really isn't any demonstrated evidence of illegal copying, of people doing something with the copies of these works that they shouldn't be doing. And it really is a reflection of how well I think we are building the international system. And ONCE has been a big part of that. And so thank you very much, Carmen. Now I'm going to go back to New Zealand and Martine for her main presentation. After that, we'll go to Martin, and then we'll deal with some questions and other comments from the panel. So, Martine.
Yes, everybody. I'm back, and my first point is coming back to the work of the ABC, or the Accessible Book Consortium. Before I talk about us as beneficiaries, so those who want the books in our hands to read, I also want to talk about some great initiatives that are out there, because we found our role is not just to enable books to become accessible to blind people, but for publishers and blindness agencies and self-publishers and universities, learning institutions, etc., to become more knowledgeable about how to publish something accessible. Because in the end, if something is born accessible and published accessible, then you can actually distribute it as far and wide as possible. So we know that the latest EPUB publication standards are accessible. So we are encouraging agencies, organizations, learning institutions to be in touch, so that if you produce your own material, that we know that it's as accessible as possible. And we realize that can happen in developing countries as well. And that is why the ABC is working with the Pacific Disability Forum. So those in the Pacific nations, many of those nations are small. They do not always have, say, for instance, an organization for the blind, organization for the deaf, organization for the physically impaired. There's often a couple of libraries. There are often very small blindness institutions. And we realize that books, school materials, that the publication of those and the making available of those can be quite critical, because it's not just like a few years ago, there you have a large print copy or a braille copy in the person's hand. We now promote low-cost braille technology, such as the Orbit, and there's others in the market now. And we also even have technologies where people can access books, whether it's learning material or fiction, whether it's for school or learning purposes or not, on their mobile phone and other downloadable devices. So we've moved from a place where we want someone to produce us a hard copy book that we can sit with it on our lap or in our hands and we can read it, to files that have been that are to be passed over to us. And because it's files, it means it can be copied. And that's sometimes where there is a huge breakdown in the availability of technology. So in today's modern era, we still have a situation where, if I talk about myself here in New Zealand, I've got about 5 ways, if not more, of accessing a book. I've got more than one app on my iPhone to download books from locally within New Zealand, as well as from internationally. I've got a small downloadable device called a Bookport, and there's many others around, like called Victor Stream and others, that you connect to the internet or to a Daisy player and you download them and you can read books on an SD card or a memory stick. I've got a Daisy player provided to me by my blindness service provider. And then I've got a smart device, Alexa. I better not say that too loud. I've renamed one of mine nearby called Computer, because I never just say computer unless I'm angry at it. So I've got one A lady called Alexa, one A lady called Computer, another one called Echo, etc. So it's very hard walking around in your house trying not to set them off. But anyway, I can thank you for the work through Sonar, which is a New Zealand company, and work through the Blind Foundation. We have all the blind low vision books that we can download, and which of course is now available through the Accessible Books Consortium. I can ask my smart home device when I'm on Wi-Fi to play any of those materials to me. So that is only a number, or I can just download it from my computer, a title. And that is because I have the technology and I have the Wi-Fi connection. We still want to advocate for places where in the end it will be literally and theoretically possible for those people to have access to hundreds and thousands of books, because they've signed the Marrakesh Treaty, ratified the Marrakesh Treaty, are busy implementing the Marrakesh Treaty, but there is not the infrastructure maybe. So we need to work and we need to advocate for the following: accessible and sustainable Wi-Fi connection, so that people can, when they're at home or work or school, access it through their device and it doesn't become expensive relying on mobile data. We need more availability on smart home technology, so that people, again, without necessarily sitting with a computer in hand, but with an inexpensive home device, whether it's Google, whether it's Alexa, whether it's whichever way we go, can ask to read them the book of their choice or their learning need. We need to, so we need those catalogs made wider available, and we also need countries to have and organizations to have access to those devices. We need an increased access to mobile phone technology so that when I'm on the road, because let's face it, many of us post-COVID would still need to get a lot of places from A to B. So you want to carry your books with you, where there's not always Wi-Fi. So whether it's through a Daisy player, whether it's through a smartphone, whether it's through whatever device is available, that those books and learning materials can be available. So I meet so many people who I can demonstrate literally when I travel from country to country what I do have. And I know in their country that they have those books available, but the people do not have the technology in their hands to sit with their book in their handbag, to sit with their book in their ear, to sit on the bus, to sit waiting for their child while their child is in hospital or waiting for someone to help them with their shopping, and they can still read. Anybody else can sit anywhere and read, and we do not want to be tied by the place where we read. So hopefully, with the work that we do, and I know that one of our seminars have been postponed, we would have had a learning seminar sponsored by Australia, by where WIPO and us went to the Pacific and do more training with people about how to make your own books accessible and how then to promote those books accessibly and what accessible technology options may mean, so that we are all a part of our own solution and not always reliant on others, on other large entities. So hopefully in the near future, or even maybe not so near future, we can do those education sessions either online or in person, but probably online, so that we can continue the work of WIPO and the Accessible Books Consortium. And my long-term vision is that whenever I meet up with people in future, online or in person, if I ask people, what are you reading? I want to hear people saying that they've got the following book on their home device, they've got something on their phone, they've got an option. They can choose whether on their phone, on a downloadable device, whether on a braille display, whether a real braille book, whether a large print book, whether they're at home on Wi-Fi. I want to hear people saying that they've got access to hundreds of thousands of books in more than one way that's been enforced on them, or that is available because of economic opportunities. And I look forward to hearing that from whether I meet someone in a developed country or a developing country. Thank you.
Thank you, Martine. And I think you raised such an excellent point. My sighted colleagues and friends take for granted that they can just pick up a book at the library if they want, or buy a book at a bookstore, or get on their iPhone and read whatever they want to read from whatever source, and do all these other things. They take it for granted. And I agree with you. We will not be fully successful until, A, we have access to all the works, and B, have access to all the same devices and methods of access that everybody else has. So there's, we've accomplished a great deal in the last little over a decade, but there's a lot more to do. So let's now turn it over to Martin, and he can talk about his project that really is a way of advocating for these rights and making sure that we start implementing the Marrakesh Treaty fully in Africa. Martin?
Thank you very much. I'll take a couple of steps back to soon after the ratification of the Marrakesh Treaty, and the World Blind Union put together a guide that was going to help individuals and organizations that wish to promote the treaty on how to do this, and this was launched, and it's a really good tool. Thereafter, in 2017, World Blind Union also organized a training of resource persons from the regions. This happened in Toronto, and Africa was lucky to get 3 slots in that training. And I happened to have been one of the beneficiaries of the training, and we were training on the use of the guide. And thereafter, we went home to do bits and pieces of work around the treaty. Back in Africa, we developed a Marrakesh Treaty ratification campaign strategy that was housed by the African Union of the Blind and ICEBI Africa. And those 2 organizations worked together for 3 years collaboratively to campaign for the ratification. We got a few very good successes. We even managed to present a keynote speech at the Ministers' Council of the Africa Regional Intellectual Properties Organization, which was a great success. All this was through the support of the World Blind Union. In 2019, I believe so, WBU intended to conduct a training in Africa for 20 participants from 10 countries on the Marrakesh Treaty. Unfortunately, just about the time it was supposed to take place, the global lockdown due to COVID came into force, and so that had to be put aside for a while. But as the year advanced, new ideas came, and WBU proposed conducting this training as an online event. And after spending time deliberating on it, it was expanded and agreed that we could create a much more comprehensive program beyond the 3-day workshop that would break down the WBU Marrakesh Treaty Guide into a simple advocacy course that would target Africa. And we did this and developed a course that would essentially take like 5 days. And the way it was designed was that we would prepare content and send it out to participants. And once they go through it, would run a 2-hour interactive session every day for 5 days. And this went really well when we advertised the course, and the first version of the course was to benefit Anglophone countries in Africa. We had a window of about a week to announce the course for people to register for it by going online and filling out a registration form. We were targeting about 30-40 people to register for that course. But to our utter surprise, there were 215 people who signed up to the course. And that was extremely surprising positively. And so we delivered the course to the people, including them attending the 2-hour sessions every day for 5 days, and completed the English part of that course before the end of December. That was extremely successful, and we are working on this in collaboration with the DAISY Consortium. Once this was done, we have translated now all the content of the course into French, and we are intending to deliver the French version of the course in a week or 2 from now, so that the Francophone Africa part of the continent will also benefit. So once the courses have been done for both Anglophone and Francophone countries, the course is migrating to online, to an online platform. We are kind of expanding the content a little beyond Africa so that the course can be taken by anyone from any part of the world as a self-paced course. And we are developing a couple of interactive content, including the recordings of those interactive sessions, so that anybody who's going to take up the course, apart from reading the content and resource material, they also get interactive content like videos and more multimedia stuff. And it's going to be in both English and in French for now. And once all the infrastructure has been done and the course is ready, I believe that WBU will be announcing the launch of the course and people can begin to take it, to uptake it. We are hoping this can be ready before the end of the year and people from around the world can take up the Anglophone and Francophone, choices for that course. There might be a little more examples coming out of Africa because originally the course was for Africa, but we've tried to also tone it down so that it can have a more international outlook. One of the things that came out of it that I think that really made me feel happy was a testimonial from somebody who allowed me to share it. She is the Vice President of the African Union of the Blind. She comes from Cameroon. Her name is Evelyn. And a month or two ago, she sent me a message, excitedly, saying, after we attended the December course on the Marrakesh Treaty, we mobilized ourselves here in Cameroon and wrote a strong petition to the president for the country to ratify the Marrakesh Treaty, and we have pushed that, and the country has agreed to ratify the treaty. She even sent me a copy of the instrument of ratification, which must have been made available to them by the authorities. And she was really excited about the success of the fruits of that trading. So that's one of the successful things we have had soon after that course. We've been doing a few other things. We're speaking with publishers and training them on aspects of the course. We have run a big webinar in Nigeria, where the immediate past president of WBU, Dr. Fred Schroeder, the immediate past president of IPA, and a couple of other very good people were at the panel, and the intention was to help Nigeria move beyond ratification to implementation of the treaty into their national law. And so that is part of the work that we are also doing, and we're excited about that. I think finally, what we are hoping is that somehow we might be able to also have a Portuguese and Spanish version or versions of the course with the initial target to the African Lusophone countries, and thereafter the course can be opened to the world when it goes online, so that the course is not only for the Anglophone and the Francophone people. So more information shall be shared once the course is ready for uptake online. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Martin, and I think this is outstanding work that you've been doing, and the course is a brilliant production, and really I look forward to the ability to make it more international and have it as a resource for everybody. You mentioned one of the very important resources that we as a WBU have to offer, and that is our implementation guide. It is on our website, on the WBU Marrakesh Treaty page, and you can follow a link to our resources, and the implementation guide is there. It is available in 8 languages currently, and it is also available from Oxford Press, who published the actual physical version of the implementation guide. So I encourage you to get that resource. It really can help you. And there have been other guides. IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations, has a guide. I believe IPA, the International Publishers Association, has a guide. So there's a lot of resources out there, and of course WIPO has a lot of information on its website about the Marrakesh Treaty. And so let's now go to questions. I think the way that we do this is through the chat, based on the way the webinar is set up, because I don't think we can recognize anybody who's not a panelist, although I'm not sure of that since I'm not the host. But so if you have a question, please put it in the chat. For example, we had one regarding because the Marrakesh Treaty is in effect a human rights treaty as well as a copyright treaty, can the principles be used in countries where it's not ratified? Well, absolutely. Now, of course, getting the treaty ratified and implemented into national law is your most secure way to enforce the rights that are contained in the treaty. But I think always you can use the principles that are in the treaty to make arguments that this is international law, that that you know that you can use these principles to make arguments that they should be applied in your country, regardless. So let's see here. Let's see what other questions we might have. And I guess, Michelle, would you like to comment on that last question regarding using some of the principles of the treaty, regardless of the country's status of having ratified or acceded to the treaty?
Sure, happy to do that, and you're absolutely right. Principles can always be used as a basis to advocate in at the national law level, and that includes, as I mentioned, bringing in the angle of compliance with the CRPD, in addition to the Marrakesh Treaty. At the same time, Scott, what you said in practical terms, I think is also true, that to take full advantage of the benefits of the treaty, for example, to receive books from the Global Book Service of the ABC, it is more practical to implement the treaty into national law, both elements of it, the exceptions and limitations, as well as the cross-border transfer provisions. But at the same time, I also think really those things go together, because the principles make a great case for the implementation and are very persuasive to legislators, to politicians in the country, that this is not only, of course, a very positive thing for them to do in terms of human rights, but that they can kind of sell it as something positive that they have done. So it can be packaged as sort of a win-win situation. So there's the principle side, super important, but also the practical side. Makes a lot of sense to work on both fronts, see how far you can get with whatever is practical in your country at the time. Sometimes there are practical barriers the legislature isn't meeting right now, for example, because of COVID. So, work on other angles of moving forward, building awareness, building participation, building interest, identifying an authorized entity, etc. And then when the time is ripe, work on the legislative side.
Absolutely. And I think, what Martin talked about earlier, in that, the course that he helped develop, it encouraged and spurred somebody in Cameroon to do some work to organize, to ultimately get to the stage where they made this turn into legislation, and it sounds like we'll be joining the Marrakesh Treaty, at some point soon down the road here. So I think that's another critical point. I think that, in the various parts of the world where we haven't gotten Marrakesh ratified, we need to organize. We need to get our organizations focused on this project and get people calling upon their legislators to work with them to ratify the Marrakesh Treaty. It just sort of proves the point that we can do a lot more work together as opposed to individuals just working alone. Now, let's see. I don't know if any other questions have come in. There was a question about whether the course Martin was describing would be translated into Spanish, and I think he did mention that's something they can work on and looking to do in the future. So here's a new question. Why is there so little something? My jaws lost it. That's the beauty of this assistive technology. Sometimes it freezes. Michelle, did you get that most recent question? My jaws is frozen up here.
Why is there so little diffusion about the Marrakesh Treaty? This is from
Antonia
from Madrid.
Maybe, is that discussion, maybe? Diffusion, I'm not sure what you would mean by that, Antonia. I think, well, I think...
Maybe publicity about it? Or?
Maybe, yeah. I think that's what perhaps is intended here. And I think this is a question that it just sort of depends... it depends where you are in the world. A few years ago when we were working hard to get the Marrakesh Treaty ratified here in the United States, there was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of publicity about it, and I know that our members of the National Federation of the Blind were all working with their senators and their members of our House of Representatives and making hundreds, if not thousands, of phone calls, sending emails. So I think it just sort of depends. It needs to be a priority of the local organizations of the blind. Do any of the other panelists, would you like to comment on that or any of the other questions?
Bueno, yo sí quería poner encima de la mesa algunas cuestiones. Primero, plantear que el objetivo del Tratado de Marrakech era poner a disposición rápidamente de todas las personas ciegas del mundo más materiales accesibles y al mismo tiempo rentabilizar el tiempo, el esfuerzo y el dinero que ya estábamos haciendo las entidades autorizadas, evitando, porque debíamos coordinarnos y así evitar, por ejemplo, las duplicidades de obras, ¿no? Creo que si vemos el panorama que tenemos actualmente, 117 países de los 170 que tiene la Unión Mundial de Ciegos, 117 países firmaron el Tratado de Marrakech, pero solamente 48, creo que son 48, han implementado ya las excepciones del tratado en sus leyes. Creo que vamos más despacio de lo que debiéramos o de lo deseable. Entonces yo sí quería poner algunas cuestiones encima, algunas oportunidades de mejora que creo que nos ofrecen valiosos retos que debemos acometer a nivel mundial, a nivel internacional. Primero es que la unión nos hace más fuertes y deberíamos de ayudar a los países que todavía no han conseguido, los ciegos de otros países que todavía no han conseguido unirse, a que lo hagan, porque son los que más dificultades tienen. Ellos también van a enriquecernos con toda seguridad al resto de personas ciegas del mundo. Una cosa muy importante que creo que también deben hacer todas las asociaciones es establecer vías de comunicación con sus gobiernos para impulsar esa implementación de las excepciones del Tratado de Marrakech. No solamente impulsarlas, sino que además deben de apoyarnos y de respaldar y acompañarnos en todo este viaje tan importante. Si los propietarios de los derechos de autor nos han abierto una ventana para que podamos compartir libros con más facilidad, los gobiernos que deberían de estar velando por las personas más vulnerables deberían tirarse por la ventana, por esa ventana en picado, para rápidamente implementar las excepciones del Tratado de Marrakech y poder dar a las personas ciegas de su país esas oportunidades de desarrollo, de mejoras de su calidad de vida, para, de alguna forma, también van a contribuir a enriquecer ese país. Los beneficios que se consiguen con toda esta lucha son bastante más que los inconvenientes que puedan acarrear. También es verdad que tenemos un tercer reto, sería conseguir un mejor asesoramiento, un punto de referencia técnico-jurídico, no solamente con guías de implementación, sino un punto de referencia más allá, ¿no? Porque los países, a la hora de implementar sus leyes, efectivamente se encuentran con muchas dudas que a veces ralentizan el proceso, incluso pueden hasta paralizarlo. Otro reto que también creo que deberíamos de acometer desde la Unión Mundial de Ciegos, es una propuesta que dejo ahí encima de la mesa, es que efectivamente IFLA y la OMPI nos ayuda a, bueno, pues a través de sus páginas podemos saber qué países han ratificado, qué países han implementado ya las excepciones del tratado en sus leyes y, por tanto, pues bueno, a qué países ya están en disposición de intercambiar libros. Pero creo que hay tanta diversidad legal, jurídica y política que sería muchísimo más ágil el que tuviéramos no una lista de países que ya han implementado las excepciones, sino una lista de entidades. Nos haría el trabajo muchísimo más fácil, porque si esa entidad custodia y mantiene un listado de estas características, el proceso de comprobación va a ser muchísimo más rápido y, por tanto, este intercambio va a ser muchísimo más ágil. También creo que debemos de establecer mejores vías de comunicación. Debemos de establecer algún espacio que nos permita intercambiar, estar más coordinados, un espacio que nos integre y que nos permita establecer vías de colaboración mucho más duraderas y efectivas, como por ejemplo que nos permitan el no hacer duplicidades de obras y que la misma obra se esté haciendo en varias entidades a la vez. Y ya por último, sí, no puedo dejar de contar el otro reto que tenemos, que es un reto técnico que nos debería de permitir unificar formatos y herramientas que utilizamos para hacer nuestros libros accesibles, porque es muy importante el que estemos homogéneos, el que seamos homogéneos a la hora de hacer un libro accesible, porque de nada sirve compartir un libro si al que se lo entregamos no puede leerlo. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think, Carmen, you hit on a couple of the big issues. You've hit on a couple of the big issues that the Accessible Books Consortium is tackling and working on. We are now almost to the end of our panel. There have been a few questions in the chat, and I think we've been answering them in the chat. I do want to say, though, that the implementation guide is available in Spanish on the WBU website. And I'd also like to say that, we're available to you at any time at WBU. I have the honor of chairing our ratification campaign committee. And so you can contact me anytime with questions about implementation or anything else. And my email is slabar, S-L-A-B, as in basketball, S-L-A-B-A-R-R-E at nfb.org. And maybe I should put that in the chat when I have a second here. Real quickly, Michelle, Martin, Carmen, do you have any closing thoughts before we sign off?
Scott, this isn't a closing thought, but I did want to say I put the link in Spanish, English, and French for the WBU guide in the chat.
Wonderful.
Plus the link in English and Spanish to the current members of the treaty from the WIPO website.
Okay, great. And do you have a closing thought?
Well, I feel kind of re-energized by this discussion to go out there and work with member states to implement the treaty. And I would really encourage them also, as you said, if we can be helpful, particularly in working on the national law, we'd be very happy to do that. So please feel free to reach out to us as well.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And I just saw there in the chat the kind words from Fiji, so thank you very much. How about you, Martine? Do you have any closing thoughts?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I would just want to say to everybody, if you are wondering or have any questions, stay in touch with your local organization or with any of us. Let us, we'd rather know if there's any matters coming up than coming a few years down the track realizing that we didn't pick up on something. And please keep your feedback so that we know that we're on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martine. And how about you, Martin?
Good. The ratification of the Marrakesh Treaty is good. It's good enough, but it's not enough. Beyond the ratification is the implementation of the treaty in national law. And beyond the implementation of the treaty in national law is its enforcement, because this is a question of rights. Even after it's gone into national law, are people receiving accessible content as a right? So far, especially in these parts of the world, most of the accessible content is content being developed or provided for by third parties, non-profit organizations, and a few government agencies. But it needs to become a right that people can demand their right to accessing content that is available in formats they can choose from. And if that right is not enforced, then they can seek a means of redress. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done even within the countries that have ratified. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Martin. And then finally, Carmen, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yes. Bueno, pues yo sí que quería animar a aquellas entidades que todavía no están en un país con las leyes implementadas a que hagan todos los esfuerzos para que estén dentro de la gran familia que formamos las personas que poco a poco iremos creciendo esa familia del Tratado de Marrakech, que se lo tomen con entusiasmo, que favorezcan que más personas consigan un mayor desarrollo personal, ¿no? Y a las que ya estamos ya hemos implementado nuestras leyes, pues sí que animo a que hagamos esfuerzos y encontremos fórmulas que nos lo hagan más fácil, que nos ayuden a crecer más rápido, más y con más eficacia. porque de verdad que hay muchas personas ciegas en el mundo y sobre todo en los países más desfavorecidos que nos necesitan y nos necesitan de verdad. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Carmen. And I just want to thank all of the panelists today for your excellent presentations and more importantly, the work you do to help us implement this most important treaty. And really, it's about implementing and securing our right to access information. That's sort of the way that I've always thought about it. When you're talking about blindness, visual impairment, print disabilities, that's one of the biggest barriers we have is getting access to information. And we have a right to access that information. And that's why it's so critical that we get this treaty adopted in every single country in the world. And we're at 105. That's a pretty good start. I would say that's a really good start. But even in those 105, less than half have actually implemented. So we have a lot of work to do there. So again, please feel free to contact us. I did put my email in the chat, slabard@nfb.org. I can certainly direct emails to other well, you're welcome. Somebody was just saying thank you in the chat. You're welcome. So anyway, please do send me an email. If we can be of further assistance, I can help direct it to other members of the panel as well if their information is not readily available. So please do get in touch. And I want to wish all of you a great rest of the summit and a tremendous day, whatever time of the day it is where you are, and let's just go out there and keep changing the world and really securing our access to information, our right to read, because after all, as the founder of the National Federation of the Blind said many years ago when creating the organization, we have a right to live in the world. So let's make it come true. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day, whatever time it might be.